Could I say one other thing about, because you mentioned the financial markets. It's interesting to me, SOCAP is starting a project on June 19th in New York called the Good Capital Project, and I'm helping them design it. Good Capital Project. Yep. They are bringing together the investment people, and they're bringing together the California, what they call the artisanal people, with the Wall Street people. And I mean, the only thing of note now, because a lot of it is going to unfold, is everybody's got the same question, right? They're looking at exactly the issues we are. What do we measure? What does it mean? What does it return? How do you balance? And there's going to be a lot of discussion and a 2-year project to come from that. But we also shouldn't overlook that we're not the only people trying to figure this out. Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I would just add, and then I won't say anything either, is that when we talk about measurement, particularly on social issues or people's behavior, it's really over time. And so it is very hard to get hard measures now for what we're setting in motion for later. And I sort of hearken back when I started the center at Babson. The donor gave the largest gift he ever gave, that Babson College ever got, to help Babson be, these were his words, I want Babson to be as much known around the world for social innovation as entrepreneurship. That was the only direction. So he had his set of what he thought that would be. And when I met with him 3 years into it, he said, so how are you measuring your success? And so I started telling him stories, and really great stories, because we started from nothing. And he said, well, I'm expecting that Babson puts X amount of social entrepreneurs into the world. I said, really? That's what your metric is? I said, did you tell that to anybody when you gave them the money? He said, no. I said, I would never measure that. That's not what I measure, so you can fire me, but that's not what I measure. So this is a long way of saying that I went along designing for what was relevant to Babson College to be able to make this happen. He had something very different in his mind. So not even having that conversation, that's when I said to him, right now the only thing I can give you are stories. So storytelling in social design at the beginning is really important because it gets you to those hardcore metrics later. But for me, storytelling is the only thing I have right now, because I don't know what these people are going to do 5 years from now, but I can tell you what I'm doing with them now. And those are powerful stories. So I think storytelling is a very, sometimes seems soft, but it's actually very hard, and it leads to the kind of hard metrics later.
I would agree completely. When I was working at the Design Council, we were doing a project with very early stage technology startups. In fact, they were still almost just about the science. And our challenge was to actually express what strategic design would do for them in terms of helping them think about what they could do with their what applications they could do with their technologies. And they hated us because we started off with stories, but that's all we had. That's all we had until we worked out the measurement logic, which I think is the form of the storytelling, that you then start to find, okay, it's here and it's here, but it's not obvious right at the beginning. Yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say, it just reminded me of a kind of, maybe a bit of urgency around it for people who work in design consultancies here. So we had a conversation today with a potential client who is Alien Council, but they asked us, so they've had to reduce or kind of achieve a social outcome, and they said, so how do you get paid? Do you if we reduce X by a certain amount, will we pay you by results? Which is like a new kind of conversation for, I think, design agencies, but it kind of makes it more urgent, I suppose, though, to move from storytelling to like an agreement about social measurement, so that you can also get paid for your work. So it's just it's a new way, I think, an emerging kind of thing for consultancies.
And it's what Participle did with Swindon Council. So Participle were looking at all of the impact of of the cost to police and social services by a very narrow margin of families that were causing, well, so-called, you know, bad families that were causing more trouble. And they pinpointed those families and they said to Swindon Council, we'll reduce that within this period of time. You're nodding because you know this story. And then, I guess...
No, I don't.
All right.
Yeah.
But this is how they pursued them. They said, we'll reduce that figure within 6 months. And they did it within 3. And so because they'd come into some contract with the council of actually having some kind of impact, that meant the council were happy to fund the second pilot. So those kinds of negotiations, I think, are critical.
And it's just really interesting because then you have to define your cohort and it becomes a much more kind of...
Absolutely.
You know, it's a social investment model.
And you need to be really careful that it doesn't become transactional, because
Yeah.
it's not.
Yeah, exactly. Or
Yes.
low-hanging fruit and
Yeah.
all the rest of it.
And also, you know what you're doing. I mean, this was a pilot as well, so I think they took a big leap. You know, it might not have worked.
On the vein of kind of being able to sell social design, it kind of, I can't help but think of service design, which was initially this kind of goodwill act of thinking about things in terms of how it provides services to people, and quite often now it's turned into a way for big corporations to essentially sell something to other companies that doesn't necessarily do good. And so I'd like to kind of ask what will prevent social design from becoming similar to service design, and also is something only considered social design if it's successful, especially if it's kind of story-based.
Who wants to take that one?
I think that's a Jesper question.
Oh, really? Interesting.
We'll help you, but you should...
Yeah, we'll back you up.
We have your back.
So I'm going to try to see if I understand your question correctly. You were saying the service design was sort of being dismissed for being unable to move into the sort of what we call rigorous measurement space, or can you just...
You get a lot of
elaborate?
companies now who promise service design, they'll do frameworks and mapping and all of this without actually really designing services in a human-centric way.
Okay, yeah, right. Well, I'm going to probably try to answer that from a very different angle, but for me, social design is involved in any, change-making effort. I guess the question is whether you recognize that or not. And if you recognize it, that's going to set out some premises around that effort. And I think a lot of what we were working at Minelab was to basically reframe public reform and public interventions as whether that was service design or whatever we talked about. But it was an exercise of reframing. And then once they accepted the reframing, then we put all the implications on that. Well, actually, that entails a different process and a different mindset, a different all of that. And a part of that exercise, I think, is to become much better at asking the question, which some of you already asked, which are who are we measuring for, and what's the purpose of measuring? And it was actually it was one of the things, it wasn't missing from the New York event, but it was sort of underplayed a little bit, which was around is it measurement for being held accountable? Is it measurement for legitimizing or validating an intervention? Is it measurement for learning? Is it measurement for creating space for something new? Is it measurement? There's so many different sorts of purposes, and when you then combine that with the fact that a lot of this is also depending on the acceptance of all kinds of new ways of knowing about people's lives and all kinds of new data in that process, then you're sort of stuck in a conversation where it's both about the legitimacy of the way that you know about the impact, but it's also blurry what the purpose should be about how you measure. And I think for me, the clarity around, or the nuance around what kind of knowledge does what, because a lot of, when you work in government, for example, a lot of what the data they use, statistical and the like, is valuable for highlighting and validating a certain problem at a large scale. It's not very valuable in terms of understanding and generating new insights about what is possible to do differently. So that was one of the conversations we had at Minelab, was saying, well, This is just two ways of knowing. There's the qualitative and the statistical, but there are all kinds of other ways. And that's the data revolution coming into the equation as well. But nuancing that discussion and then being much more clear about, what's useful. I think it's extremely concerning how the current measurement paradigm is creating a sense of a mode of rationality in government and beyond that basically undermines the any sort of approach to be explorative or creative in the way that you would solve or approach a problem. But I do think that the design community and beyond has also missed an opportunity to become much more clear about what they can do and what they can't, and what's realistic in terms of measurement. Because I agree on that comment in terms of measurement is overrated. I actually think maybe the word even is a problematic thing that we should discuss.
I mean, certainly the way it's hit public services in the UK, measurement has been used as a tool to hit people over the head,
Right.
and people end up gravitating towards the quickest solution rather than actually, doing the work with generosity and purpose. They end up taking the shortest path, and that's really done measurement a bad service in that sort of way.
And I would say just on the people who mentioned the challenge of who takes the credit, because a lot of the measurement activities is also about being able to prove that we did something and see, there it is, rather than, not rather than, and that's understandable as well, but that's another way of doing measurement. So I think, being more clear, I think that would sort of be my version of at least addressing the challenge you were saying.
I know Nick has a question. I just want to address that in a different way. One of the things that was sort of funny, but not in the graduate program, is that it never occurred to us that we would have to kind of define or make it clear that it had to be a social problem that people were addressing. And it came up because some people just started doing things that would make their lives easier and more convenient for their friends, and until one young man from China finally said, "Why can't I help the affluent?" And we said, "Yeah, you can, but not here." So, we've had to go back and say it has to be a need, right? It has to be a demonstrable social problem that affects a lot of people. You don't necessarily have to work with a lot of people at once, but I think one of the ways to evaluate is the intention. And of course, it's the intention that leads to how do you know whether you succeed?
It's just to follow up on the beginnings of the story that you were telling about the Humanising Technology project. Oh, sorry. To follow up on the story about the Humanising Technology project, because I think there was something extraordinary there about the mismatch in expectations between the facts and, if you like, the figures. So, to put it in context...
And exactly to your point about two different perspectives. Sorry.
Most commercial technology startups are a total failure. There's a 99% failure rate. And if you could change that by 1%, what might you have learned? And so there was a cohort of 8 very early stage, it's like on bleeding edge science, up to electronics, a bit of artificial intelligence, another was a fuel cell, another was like nano powders. And the idea was to place designers with those companies and get them to use their imaginations and see what was here. And ultimately the goal is, how could you make these technology companies more useful, more purposeful, more successful, more sustainable? And what was intriguing was the Design Council hired another agency to come in and measure the success or failure of this project, right? And the thing is, the big fact was, after 5 years, all 8 companies were all still in business. Done. That's the only fact you need, actually. You've just got 100% success rate. in a context which has a 99% failure rate. So what does that tell you about what might be the value of what we did? One of those companies, Ceres Power, was a fuel cell company that went on to a very successful IPO on the stock exchange. The multiplication of value. That's just measuring it by financial success and conventional terms. But what was intriguing was what Ceres Power did, and the design intervention they needed, was they hired 2 animators from Brighton to tell their story about how the fuel cell embedded itself in the infrastructure and technological ecosystem. That animation, about a minute, using the animator's art, told the story of their product and the impact it might have on the world. I mean, I think maybe they paid $1,000 to the 2 animators. The IPO was worth X million. The multipliers involved were not what the measurement agency was interested in. They were interested in causality. What little bit pushed that bit 2% that way? What little bit of design intervention pushed it this way? And we said, you're missing the big story here. The big story is they're still in business. This one was a major success. The multipliers are off the scale like you wouldn't believe. And it kind of almost didn't fit into their spreadsheet.
Right. That's a great point.
Like getting, so I suppose it's like who measures and why. Do you get an external organisation in to measure, or should it be the organisations measuring themselves so they can improve? But accountability, proof, or learning.
I've just got a very brief point to that. We've done something in some of our projects where we've done sort of a hybrid inside-outside approach. So because it's so useful for us to go through the process of evaluating our own products, and we learn so much, but yet it's important to have the external validation. We've sometimes partnered with an external organisation who's reviewed our methodology and then also all of our data, and then looked at the outcome. So it's not going to be as sort of credible as a totally outside approach, but it's a lot more credible than a totally inside approach, and allows us to hold on to that knowledge. So I just thought that I'd share that. That's been quite useful for us.
Did the external person feed in on your evaluation approach at the beginning?
Yes, so it wouldn't work otherwise, because otherwise they'd just be like, why did you do that? Yeah.
Great stuff. Have we got another question? Do you want to stay with the...
Again, it's just a request for cool tools and stuff that are out there, but I used to work with central government on evaluating large-scale behaviour change programmes, and I always really, really wanted to do RCTs and cohort studies, but why are they so expensive? And do you know anyone who's innovating in this area? Because digital has disrupted the ethnographic space, so most obvious example is diary studies and the use of mobile. Who is disrupting and making RCTs really big, heavy, expensive measurement? Who's making that cheaper and accessible to organisations?
Can I ask you RCT for those that don't know in the room?
Randomised control trial. Does everyone know?
Can I echo that question? I would just love to know the answer.
Yeah.
Well, I can advertise my own organisation on that. I think we have a number of units within Nesta that's trying to slowly sort of move away from the large-scale RCT into a more quick, small-scale sort of, but still rigorous approaches to that. I guess.
Do you have examples?
Sort of sorry?
Do you have examples?
We can talk about that afterwards. I'm still.
Is the work shareable?
It is, yeah. And I guess one of the, it is, and we can talk about that definitely. So we have the Innovation Growth Lab that is doing some work on that. We also have part of our impact assessment team is also, impact investment team is doing that as well. I don't know enough about that work. From our team, I could say one of the things what we've tried to do recently is to basically create a continuum of experimentation, because we feel like there's too much emphasis on the sort of, I don't know if you call it the back end, but the heavy end in terms of validating the hypothesis, but that implies that you have the right hypothesis and you're quite sure that actually is the way to go forward, and then you put up the RCT. and maybe I'm biased, but I have seen my share of really horrible RCTs, large scale, waste of money, ruining people's lives, experiments in my short lifetime. So I do think that question is quite urgent, but there's also a question or a conversation to be much more, again, nuanced around from establishing a hypothesis to be tested all the way to validating it. There are so many things you can do along that journey that some of them have a lot to do with design-led stuff, but there are also other things that should just be a part of that conversation. And I think it's the interplay between those methods, even in the later stages where you sort of adapt and I would just sort of add on to that. But I do have colleagues you should talk to.
We FutureGov works with Nesta because you guys invested in us.
Funny, yeah, I know.
But yeah, I'd just be really interested if anyone's tried more nimble approaches around some of that stuff.
I mean, I imagine also when you're first starting out in this kind of thing as well, you don't necessarily have the confidence to be able to suggest a methodology and to resist that kind of pressure to do that kind of action. And one of the things about, I guess, at least sharing this knowledge means we start to get, some more things at your fingertips to be able to say, actually, this is not the only way. If you insist, we'll do it, but we might need to do a range of things to do that.
I just want to say that conversation I've experienced is really, really important because...
And hard, I imagine.
Very hard, because even within an organisation, sometimes there are different views about whether an RCT is valuable. And so we've had people who are looking for investment who've been really super keen on doing an RCT because that's what they need in order to get buy-in. And then the research team being like, precisely because of maybe some uncertainty around a hypothesis and also issues, statistical issues, being much less certain and wanting to take a more gradual approach, which is much more about learning and the process. I mean, even within an organisation where everybody's talking to each other, everyone shares the same interests, the only way that's resolved is through having conversations with funders and changing the perception about the value of measuring the learning process. I think that's...
Can I just reference on that? There's a PhD thesis you should read, which is called The Absurdity of the Decision, I think. It was one of my former colleagues from MindLab. It's basically an ethnographic account of a RCT in the employment services in Denmark, where they quite early on realized that this experiment is not going to work, but they carried it out anyway because they have invested 200 million crowns in it, which means instead of basically they want to prove the theory, right? So they get people to adapt in, and they will twist their words, and these the target group here was long-term unemployed people and work-injured people. So very fragile people already, and basically what they do is they make them more sick because the experiment has to work.
And it's really interesting because I think one of the deep values here is honesty, and measurement is an attempt to get to more honesty, and sometimes quantitative measurement is really an attempt to do that, because you can tell any story you like, but what's the hard data saying? But then sometimes that hard data is you making it say things that aren't honest, and you're not going through an honest process to get there. And I mean, I think that's just a very difficult thing to grapple with, because failure is not easy.
And I think on that note, I think measurement sort of inherits the same problem as the concept of innovation, which pretends as it's neutral. And any sort of measurement scheme, has a bias. Which it was interesting when Cassie mentioned, they're measuring influence rather than impact. I think that's a really interesting one. I'd like to hear more about that. Because it's never, in that particular experiment, it was the political intent that created or adapted the measurement so that they could prove their theory, rather than the impact of the. So there's a there's a conversation there as well.
There's another article to go along with your article, which I'll make sure that Cheryl has, called "Productive Stupidity." And it's in a science journal, and it does speak to being able to hold that mindset of productive stupidity, like a lot of people who do experiments and scientists, because it allows you to see the mistakes and then pivot and change. And I know that in trying to do work with some foundations and they want something measured and we attempt to measure it, sometimes when I'm not productively stupid, I actually can be stupid and do the things they want me to do, which gives them the outcomes that are really misleading. So there's, it's how to cultivate a little bit of a mindset of productive stupidity to actually get you to a much more sustainable way of looking at something.
It also seems that one of the things that came up only a little bit at the convening we had, but we've spent a lot of time thinking about it afterwards, is so much of this comes down to the RFP, right? How is the request for proposal? How is the request being framed, and what are the expectations going into it? So we've spent a lot of time talking about how we actually create models for an RFP that create conditions for the most success. And Tracy Johnson from Gates is going to be working on that with us. But I think a lot of those things are just so baked into what we're asked to do. And often you're competing for a project, right? You're not in a position to say, you guys are asking all the wrong questions. So something we want to work on.
Any more questions? No. Okay.
Can we ask questions?
Yeah. Should we just let them have a? Should we just have a little break? We've got some water up here and grapes and some peanuts. If you just want to grab a little cup of something and just have a little refresh, because we can ask you some questions.